Hello, 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 and welcome back to the Spicy Bits podcast, your home for the freshest, hottest takes on everything ranging from politics to religion to society and so much more. I am so sorry that it has been so long since the last episode, but you know what? We're here, we're back, and we're gonna get into it once again. This episode, we are going to be talking about, of course, a controversial topic, right? And we are going to be talking about gender, gender identity, gender roles, gender norms, all of that. So, let me preface this by saying the reason I wanted to discuss this topic is because I hold a belief, and I hold a theory along with it that I'm going to be talking about today, but I hold a belief that we are seeing within the last, 4 or 5 decades, we are seeing an increasing number of people who have alternative gender identities. And what I mean by that is people who identify as trans, non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, all of that sort of thing. We are seeing an increased resurgence of that. And some people say that that is just because those people with alternative gender identities, right, they have existed throughout all of human history, and only recently has society become more accepting of those things, and so there's just more people that are open about it, but there were a lot of closeted people before. I'm going to disagree with that, though. Like, I think that is true when it comes to sexuality, right? Because, like, homosexuality, for example, that is nothing new. That has been around for centuries. It's mentioned in the Bible. I'm pretty sure it's mentioned in the Quran, too. We know it's existed throughout history. I mean, just look at the, like, ancient Greek and Roman bathhouses. You know, like, that's not a new phenomenon. Homosexuality, you could argue bisexuality, same idea, not really a new thing. That's been the case for a while. However, I don't think that that is necessarily true with transgenderism and non-binary. I don't think that there have been like a bunch of, closeted trans people throughout human history. I think that in particular is a very new phenomenon, and I think it is a cultural reaction. So I'm going to explain here, I'm going to explain my theory on why I think that is becoming increasingly prevalent in our society and where I think those sorts of alternative gender identities originated from. So my belief, my theory is that it originates from kind of the incredibly strict traditional gender roles, which we typically associate with the 1950s, but it actually goes as far back as the Victorian era in Western society, where there's all these ideas of what is ladylike, what is manly, what is proper, right? And there's these sorts of norms, these gender norms of women are supposed to dress, act, think, and behave like this. Men are supposed to dress, think, act, and behave like that. And from that comes, all kinds of ideas about psychology, right? How women think, even people like Freud, there was this idea of women as hysterical from the word, similar to hysterectomy, right? The word for a woman's uterus, right? The idea that women are emotional beings, that stems from these sorts of traditional gender roles that were prevalent at the time of women must think, act, behave, dress like this. Men think, act, dress, behave like that. And the problem with that view, in my opinion, the problem with that view is that it is a view of gender as doing, not as being. So, in other words, a lot of the people who are considered the most transphobic, right, the people who are what's called biological essentialists, they believe that your gender is inherent based on your biology. If you drill down into it, they don't actually really believe that. right? Because if gender is truly what you are born as, then it means that if you are born a man, for example, you are a man no matter what. No matter what you think like, dress like, act like, talk like, you are a man, right? If you, want to wear a dress, if you want to grow your hair out, if you want to wear makeup, you are still a man, right? That is the view of biological essentialism. And accordingly, there's also the view that there's no like norm of what a man should be, because if you are born a man, that is what you are, right? There's not these norms as far as what you should do to be a man or to be a woman. It's just how you're born. So what that means then is that anyone who is born a man is just as manly and just as much of a man as anyone else born that way. So for example, two people both born male, one likes to wear, makeup and high heels, the other doesn't. According to pure biological essentialism, both of them are equally as manly and equally as much of a man because they were both born male. It doesn't matter what they do, it doesn't matter what they think, it doesn't matter what they act like, dress like, etc. They're both men because that's how they're born. But the thing is, many of the political conservatives who advocate for biological essentialism don't actually really believe that. Why? Because they're still advocates of these sorts of traditional gender roles and gender norms. They don't truly believe that a man wearing a dress, for example, is just as manly as a man who doesn't. Why? Because they still hold to this idea of gender as being, not as doing, or sorry, gender as doing, not as being. And I think, my belief is that these alternative gender identities are a reaction to those sorts of traditional gender roles that were culturally imposed, right? It is a reaction to that, but it is a reaction still based on the fundamental ideal of gender as doing, not as being, as gender as performative, not as innate, right? And I think we see that in the sense, for example, non-binary, right? Perfect example of that. Trans too, we'll get into that, but non-binary I think is a great example of that sort of reaction, right? Because it's somebody who is born, could be born male, could be born female, doesn't really matter, right? They're born male, they're born female, but they look at these prescriptive roles that are assigned to them based on however they're born, right? It is drilled into them by society, right? If you're born a man, you need to be this way. If you're born a woman, you need to be that way. And they look at those and they go, well, I don't fit into either one of those. I don't want to dress, act, think like this, but I also don't want to dress, act, think like that. So maybe I'm not male or female, right? If this is what it means to be a man, is that I have to dress, think, act, behave a certain way, and to be a woman, I have to dress, act, think, behave a certain way, and I don't do either one of those things, then maybe I'm neither a man or a woman, right? And I think that's where this idea of identifying as non-binary comes from. It comes from this idea of gender is something you do, it's not who you are. And so if you don't identify with the roles that are culturally ascribed to certain genders, you're not going to identify with that gender. And I think it's the same thing with transgenderism, right? Somebody who is born male, right, they're told their whole lives, you need to dress, think, act, be like this if you're a man. And they say, well, but that's not who I am, right? I don't want to do those things. I don't want to dress like that. I don't want to act like that. So if my personality is more feminine, if my sense of style is more feminine, right, according to what is socially determined as a feminine sense of style and personality traits and all that sort of thing, then maybe I'm a woman. If I seem to fit better into how women are supposed to act and dress rather than how men are, right, then maybe I should just identify as a woman then, right? Or vice versa, if you're, born a man and you identify as a woman, same idea. Or, sorry, born a woman, identify as a man. You get the idea, right? Same idea, either way. It's this idea of I'm going to identify, it's still this idea of I'm going to identify based on what certain genders are supposed to do, act, think, dress, behave like, how certain genders are supposed to be expressed. And that's where we get into ideas of gender expression, right? That I'm going to identify based on certain gender expressions. And so it's still this idea of gender as doing, not as being. And it's a countercultural reaction to strict gender roles. It is a countercultural reaction to being put into a box, right? And it's people who say, well, I don't fit into this box, I don't fit into that box. But instead, all they have done is created their own box. They're saying, okay, I don't fit into box A, I don't fit into box B, I'm going to fit myself into box C, right? And I think we see that in today's society quite a bit, in the sense of anyone now who does not act in alignment with the traditional gender roles is now assumed to be queer, right? We've created a third box. We're still boxing people in based on how they perform, what they do, what they act like, not who they are. So, for example, right, a man, born male, right, maybe he identifies as straight, but if he has what is culturally considered to be feminine hobbies or personality traits, right, people assume that he's queer of some kind. Maybe he's trans, non-binary, gay, whatever, but people assume that he is queer because of how he acts, because of how he talks, because of how he dresses, whatever. We make assumptions on gender based on how people act and not how they're born. If we truly believed, okay, if we truly believed in gender as biologically inherent, then we wouldn't make those sorts of assumptions about people's gender or sexuality just based on how they're acting and performing. But we do, and the reason why we do is because now we've created queer as sort of this third box to categorize people in. We're still categorizing people based on what they do, how they act, how they behave, dress, think, etc., right? We're still classifying people based on what they're doing and not who they are, not how they're born as. Now, my belief, right, and some people may disagree with me, some people may say it's transphobic, whatever, but my belief is that pure biological essentialism, not the kind that is touted by conservative political pundits, that is really just thinly veiled code for reinforcement of traditional gender roles, which is not biologically essentialist at all, actually. But my belief is that pure biological essentialism is actually the most freeing of all possibilities. Why? Because it gives you the ability to just be, right? There's no confusion, there's no, well, I'm not really sure what my identity is because I don't seem to fit into what society expects me to act like or be like based on my gender, right? There's just this idea of, okay, I was born one way, I was born the other way, but that does not mean I have to act a certain way, think a certain way, talk a certain way, dress a certain way, whatever. It's the idea of if you are born a man, you are a man, no matter what. You can do whatever you want. You can act however you want, dress however you want, think however you want. You're still a man. Same thing if you're a woman, right? And I think that is the most freeing possibility because it gives you the solace, right, of knowing exactly what your identity is, right, what your gender is. There's not all this gender confusion and dysphoria based on socially constructed narratives of how certain genders are supposed to be and feeling like you don't fit into those and all that sort of thing. There is this solidity, right, this feeling of certainty of who you are based on what you're born as, but at the same time, that identity does not limit you in any way. There's no pressure of, well, because I was born a certain way, now I have to act a certain way, dress a certain way, fit into certain social expectations. None of that. It's like, yes, you are born this way, that is your identity, but you can do whatever you want, you can be whoever you want. You are not limited, you are not boxed in. And the thing is, we don't really treat any other minority group that way, at least not anymore, right? We don't look at somebody who is a racial minority and say, okay, because you are a racial minority, you need to act this way, dress this way, talk this way, whatever. Anybody who did that would be considered a bigot because they're stereotyping, right? We would say that's ridiculous, that's so racist to assume that, right? That just because you are born a certain race does not mean you need to perform a certain way or act a certain way. You're born in that way, that is your identity, yes, but that does not limit you, that does not define you. You can still be whoever you want, do whatever you want, think however you want, act, dress however you want, right? So why do we do that with gender? Why do we limit ourselves so much by saying, okay, if you're a certain gender, you have to do all these things, act a certain way, dress a certain way, and if you don't, well, then you must fall into this third alternative box of queer, right? If you don't do the traditional things, then you must be queer then, because only queer people don't fit into traditional gender norms. And all we've done then is just created a third stereotype, right? We're still limiting people, we're still defining people, we're still stereotyping people. We've just created a third box now, a third stereotype where, okay, if you don't fit into the traditional masculine stereotype or the traditional feminine stereotype, well, now you fit into the queer stereotype. And it's just as limiting and just as constricting. And I think that the best way, right, that the best way to free ourselves from this sort of gender-based prison, if you will, is to adopt a view similar to the view that we hold when it comes to minorities. This view of no matter who you are, what you do, what you act like, you are what you're born as, right? That, your identity does not change. You are born into a certain identity, but at the same time, that identity does not limit you. It does not confine you to a stereotype of a particular set of behaviors or actions or dress that is expected of you, right? That you have your identity, but regardless of your identity, you are still free to be the unique human being that God created you to be. I think that is the most freeing possibility. But anyway, that is my theory as to why I think we are seeing an increase in, transgender, non-binary, etc. people. And I will also add, I do think that is in part why there is such a high rate of suicide among those groups, high rate of suicide and depression, right? A lot of people say it's because society isn't really fully accepting of trans folks and all this sort of thing, but I think it's because even this sort of alternative identity of transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, whatever, right? That sort of alternative identity is still confining, it's still constricting. Yes, you've removed yourselves outside of the traditional boxes of masculinity and femininity, but all you've done is put yourself into a third box and a third stereotype with a different set of expectations and norms and behaviors for yourself. And so you have still confined yourself. You've just confined yourself differently from how people used to 100 years ago, but it's just as restrictive. And I think that's why there's these high rates of mental health, because it's not really freedom. It's not really an escape from traditional gender roles, because it's still holding this idea of gender as doing, not as being. And it's once we accept the idea of gender is who you are, not what you do, then, and only then, will we ever truly be free. Thank you all, by the way, for listening to the second episode of the Spicy Bits podcast, and especially for staying with me until the end. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hope it helped you think, right? But if for any reason you did not like anything I said and you would like to roast me for it or argue with me about it, feel free to do so, right? We are big proponents of free speech here, so go follow us on Instagram at SpicyBitsPod, and we have a post up for each episode. Comments on that post are open, so any disagreements, questions, concerns, whatever, post it on the comments for the post for this episode, episode 2. Only thing that I ask, same thing I asked last episode, just don't DM me, okay? It just feels a little hostile, a little personal. Just, if you have an issue with the content of the podcast, comment on the post. And go follow us on Instagram, and thank you very much for listening. Stay tuned for the next podcast.